All right, today I am excited to talk with Ashley Kuchar, who's a PhD student studying educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. Go Horns, it's my alma mater too. And over the last 4 years, she's been working hard to develop a program that teaches athletes how to respond with resilience in the face of adversity. And I got connected with Ashley through Krista Neff, who I met at a yoga and science conference. And Ashley, welcome. I'm really, really glad to be interviewing you and speaking with you and learning from you. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Will you tell me a little bit more about yourself and your research background?
Yeah, so I'm in my hopefully final year of my PhD program, maybe a year and a half.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, I've been really interested in this idea of resilience in the face of adversity and motivation and just responses to failure, especially with how we treat ourselves. And so I'm working here at UT with Kristen Neff, who studies self-compassion, was kind of the academic founder of this idea, developed a scale to measure it. And then since I've been here, I've been trying to adapt it for athletes. And then my dissertation work is I've developed a program that I'll be running in the next few months, specifically for athletes and teaching them these adaptive ways to respond to adversity, mistakes, failure.
Okay. I have this earnest belief that our work finds us, that we don't find our work. And so I'm curious about how this work found you and how your athletic background is woven into this story.
Yes, I think oftentimes we study the things that we need the most, or at least for me, that was the case. So growing up as an athlete, and in high school, I played softball and basketball, but I grew up my whole life playing sports. And, in sports, we're typically pretty tough on ourselves, and self-criticism is the way we try to motivate. And that was definitely me, also very perfectionistic. And in college, I played basketball, had a Division II school in Colorado, and my junior year, I took a class called Stereotyping and Compassion with Sue Krause. And we learned first about mindfulness and this idea that, for me, this is what I really took from it, was that mistakes could just be mistakes. They didn't have to mean I was a mistake, or I didn't have to blow it out of proportion. It could just be a data point. We could see things with this curiosity. It didn't have to be good or bad. It was just something I could learn from. And that was really powerful for me. Someone who was very, very hard on themselves, expected perfection, also didn't want to fail. And then from there, we learned about self-compassion. And Kristen Neff has this kind of classic exercise to introduce self-compassion called How Would I Treat a Friend? And in that exercise, you think about a situation where you are quite hard on yourself and the things you say. So for me, it's like classic saying to myself, I'm not good enough, I'm an idiot, right? Quite harsh, strong language. And then you think about someone you really care about. And I remember very clearly, I thought about my mom. And you imagine that person saying those things that you say to yourself, but they're saying it to themselves. And I kind of imagine my mom just kind of railing on herself in her room, and me like peeking through the door. And if I heard my mom yelling at herself saying, I'm not good enough, I'll never be good enough, I shouldn't be here, I would be appalled. And I would say, wait, hold up. It was just one mistake. It's okay, right? Keep it's fine. You're great, and build her up. And then you think, well, now turn that compassion we have towards others, towards yourself. And my mind was blown. It honestly changed my whole kind of worldview, my view of myself. And in that moment, I was hooked. And I was like, this is such a powerful concept. And I need to help athletes gain this, because there is this culture of toughness and criticism, and that seeing that as a strength. But I knew there were some big barriers. I knew that the language could be seen as soft, and even for me, it was soft. But as kind of a psychology student, I was open to it. And so from then on, I was set that this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to bring this idea of self-compassion to athletes.
this is a great story. And I was going to ask you, what was your aha moment? But you just completely told me the answer to that question.
Yeah.
And this is a little bit sort of out there and woo woo, but athletes are so connected to their bodies, right? And we often don't connect our mind to our body. Can you conjure up the memory of how it felt in your body when you began to realize that this was a helpful tool and that you could use it on yourself? Like, do you remember anything that changed in your body once you started to embrace this practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a release for me.
Mm-hmm.
We even, in the self-compassion world, they teach self-criticism is like holding your fists really, really tight as you can. And it's tense, it's painful. It can also feel powerful, but
Mm-hmm.
it's quite uncomfortable. And once you release your hands and you have that mindfulness, or you put your hands on your heart, it's a totally different physiological reaction, right? When you are treating yourself with some kindness and encouragement and motivation and wisdom, then within your body, and especially if you're adopting some kind of touch, right, something that can help you, you're going to feel that release, and also the safety and security within your body, right? So for me, I guess it would say like having some peace. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember at the Yoga and Science Conference, Kristen led us through the exercise of clenching your fists and clenching your body and putting your hand on your heart. And I just remember that the kind of persistent, sometimes stomach upset or nausea that I have if I'm stressed out, it dissipated, it just melted away, and
Yeah.
my heart rate slowed, and my racing thoughts slowed down, and everything. It was just so that my parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part I call it kind of the brake pedal of your nervous system, it engaged and just slowed everything down.
Right.
It was almost like a euphoria.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
Especially when you're contrasting it with the tension and tightness that you're feeling in your body,
yes.
right? That
Yes.
contrast of like
Mm-hmm.
the push, we have to go, feeling the pressure, the racing thoughts, and then you just kind of let it go and think, what do I need right now? It's like
Mm-hmm.
such a release.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very empowering to notice that you can change that about yourself, that you have control over that.
Right, right. Even just stopping to pause and taking a few deep
Mm-hmm.
breaths is going to slow down your heart rate and, like you said, engage that parasympathetic nervous
Mm-hmm.
system.
Yeah. How do you define self-compassion?
Yeah. So self-compassion, in short version, would be treating yourself the same way you treat someone you care about, a good
Okay.
friend. There's also these three core components that have their opposites. So we have mindfulness,
Mm-hmm.
common humanity, and self-kindness. Mindfulness is going to be that balanced, non-judgmental, present moment awareness. Then the opposite of that would be over-identification. So if I made a mistake, I would over-identify thinking I am a mistake. Those two are kind of contrasting. Then you have common humanity, which is this understanding that everyone struggles, everyone suffers, everyone makes mistakes, versus isolation, which would be I'm the only one, or no one knows what it feels like. And then we have the self-kindness, which again would be treating yourself with kindness as opposed to self-criticism and self-judgment. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And I'd actually like to later on loop back to those three components of self-compassion, and maybe you can walk us through a practical exercise for a common struggle that athletes have, and especially when it pertains to injury.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And as you mentioned before, these are my words, not yours, but self-compassion can seem kind of woo-woo, and athletes aren't generally wired that way. Not to mention, many athletes determine their worth and success based on metrics, and they're relentless about pushing themselves and achieving and getting faster and stronger. And I always say that in between a stimulus and a response is a pause, and in that pause is your power. But so many athletes either don't pause, or they take that pause to continue to rail on themselves and push harder, when really they could employ self-compassion in that pause, and then that could make them stronger. So how can we take that pause and make it a bridge between self-compassion and relentless achievement?
Yeah, so I think it starts with an understanding of why we use that self criticism and why
Mm-hmm.
that it's not necessarily bad. That the self criticism is typically used to protect ourselves, is to protect ourselves from perceived threats. So, if we take an injured athlete, there are lots of perceived threats of being injured. There might be a loss of athlete identity. There might be worries about important others and what they might think of us. There might be a loss of control. And all of those things are perceived threats, right? They're scary. They could be seen as dangerous. And so our self-critic is trying to prevent that from happening, prevent that suffering from happening. The problem is it's not always adaptive. Sometimes we might push and we actually end up being injured, or maybe we end up quitting, but we're still failing in some way. So first, it can be really helpful to understand that self-criticism isn't always bad, and it's trying to protect you. But it's important to recognize that it's only helpful to a point. Once you recognize, hey, here's what I'm worried about, or here's what might happen, then you can kind of thank your inner critic, say, thanks for helping me, thanks for trying to help, but what you're saying isn't that helpful for me right now. If I'm continuing to rail on myself, I'll probably end up getting discouraged. Or in the long term, it's not adaptive to continually beat yourself up over and over and over again. There's a time and a place, but it's just not, if you look at what are the consequences of self-criticism, it's not that helpful. The problem is, though, is there's such pressure to act in that way. It's seen as tough. It's accepted, especially within sport, right? Like, oh, I'm hard on myself, or I'm such a tough athlete because I can handle it if my coach is yelling at me, versus the opposite of if you get upset when a coach yells at you, especially if you're a male athlete, they're going to call you a sissy, right?
Yep.
Also for women athletes, it's the same, right? Men or women athletes.
Absolutely.
Deal of toughness.
And then there's the other component of social media pressure, right?
Yes.
That's out
right,
there too.
Exactly. Right. If you see an athlete crying or something, you're going to say, toughen up, come on, right? But what's interesting is when you teach athletes about this idea of self-compassion, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. How maybe I say, okay, Ash, you made a mistake, or you've got a stress fracture right now. What are my outcomes? What do I want to gain from this? Or how do I want to respond? And what are the consequences of it? And I can probably choose and decide what's going to be helpful for me. Mm-hmm. But the problem is often we miss that pause, and we don't know that it's okay to treat ourselves in a different way. We're just so wired to treat ourselves with criticism, and it can also be hard to think, like, if I ask myself, like, what do I need right now? We don't always know, because we're in that threat defense system. It's already activated. Mm-hmm. But what can be really helpful is think about someone else, right? Again, taking this compassion for others, or the compassion that others have towards us, and tap into that. So in that moment of failure or struggle or adversity, I might think, okay, who's like my wise kind of ideal, compassionate, motivating coach, or teammate, or friend, or parent, sibling, future self, whatever, this ideal person, and think, what would they say to me right now? Would they say, get your butt to work and get out there? Or it doesn't matter if you're injured, just keep going. But if they're wise, maybe not, right? Maybe they say, hey, take a break, figure out what you need to do, take a deep breath, you got this. All right, now let's go. It's time to go. Learn what you got to learn, and then move forward. And so making that connection between how a compassionate or encouraging response is drawn to performance is so important for athletes, and seeing how the self-criticism can harm their performance, to what degree it's helpful and to what degree it's not helpful, I think is crucial in order to reach this really high level of achievement.
That's some really, really sage advice and insight. So thank you very much for that. And to correlate that to what I do in my practice, one of the exercises that I'll have my injured athletes do that I feel could use more self-compassion is to sit down to close their eyes, set a timer for 5 minutes, and think about the person who cares about them the most in their lives. And then think about when they're with that person, how do they feel in their body? What does that person look like? Like using their senses to conjure up that person. And then when the timer goes off, write themselves a letter from the viewpoint of that person.
Yeah. Yep.
And there's something very healing about both the visualization and using the senses to conjure up that person, as well as picking up a pen and writing a letter.
Yes, agreed. Those are both really common, powerful self-compassion practices as well.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I like to remind people of is that when we're injured or when we're struggling with any kind of a stress, we get stuck in a bottle and then we can't read the label on the bottle. It becomes impossible. And so what I tell people is make sure that you have one person in your life that can read the label, but not everybody has that. And so what I'm hearing from you is really helpful, and that we can and we can be our own label readers, and we do actually have that innate ability. It's just shifting our mental space and what we're thinking about.
Exactly. Yeah. And each of us, of course, it's going to be helpful if you have people you can draw on, experiences with real people. And it's surprising what you can come up with when you're tapping in and you're thinking, okay, what would be the best response for me right now that's going to improve my performance, my well-being, and my motivation, right? Think like, what would someone say to me? And we can come up with all sorts of different things, whether it's physical gestures or self-care activities or whatever, or words. And that's coming from you, right? We're tapping into someone else, real or imagined, it doesn't matter, but it's coming from you. And you have that knowledge and wisdom inside. We just have to unlock it. And it can be really challenging. I'm not saying that this is easy all the time. Sometimes we need to set reminders. Sometimes we're going to have a day when we're just really hard on ourselves.
Yeah.
But you can practice self-compassion both in the moment, both preemptively, thinking about situations where maybe you don't have very much self-compassion, and retroactively. I can look back to a situation and say, man, that was not the smartest response. I just gave up yesterday and I could have done something a little bit different. And make a point to think about that, right? And put yourself in that situation. That's all practice, and it's all really beneficial. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I found the practice of self-compassion through a friend, Laura Schmidt, who's a therapist and practices internal family systems, and then also a lot of self-compassion works through Kristen and then Chris Germer. And so she introduced me to their work when I was at the beginning of my injury, so years and years ago. And I think because athletes are so used to tapping in into their body, into their muscles and their balance and their movement and their proprioception, when they start to tap into this other part of themselves, it's kind of like, I love metaphors and I'm a mountain biker. So it's kind of like if you see something pretty off in the distance and there isn't a trail there, and you think, I really want to see that, but there's no trail. And so you start bushwhacking. And when you do that, you inevitably, the first few times that you ride or walk on that trail, you end up with, cuts and scrapes and bloody shins from whatever might have been growing there. But the more that you go back to that trail and wear down the path, the easier it is to get to that view.
That's a great analogy. Yeah.
And so it's, I found that when I started this practice, I was almost kind of resentful. I was like, is this going to work? Like, this is, I didn't really think that this was the answer to a lot of the shame and the frustration and the just feeling trapped in my own body feelings that I had, but it helped me so much.
Yeah.
And it was a very intentional practice. Like the same way that I showed up to go on a 60-mile ride when it was 32 degrees, windy and raining outside, because that was on my schedule. I had to just take that focus and go, I'm doing this today, because practicing self-compassion will help my psyche, it will help my brain, it will help my nervous system, which will eventually, not eventually, but it will directly feed into healing my body. And everything is just so connected. And as athletes, I think we're very partitioned and siloed. We're like, body, body, mind.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
you made a few really good points that I liked is one, there's going to be this kind of mindset shift. So even just like when I first learned about self-compassion, it was a mindset shift for me, and it affected me in really good, positive ways. Then the other part is an actual practice, whether it's every day with some sort of consistency, or just at least sometimes, right? More than what I was doing before. But that intentional practice is where you're going to see the biggest change and improvement. And then the other thing you're talking about is just this idea of bushwhacking and getting cut and bruised, and it's challenging at first. And self-compassion, mindfulness and self-compassion, there's this idea of backdraft. But sometimes when we engage in compassion, we actually have this resistance to it. It could be for a lot of reasons. Sometimes growing up, maybe compassion wasn't safe. In sports, sometimes it's not seen as safe, it's seen as harmful if you're compassionate. And so there can be some resistance to it. And it's important to notice that and continue to kind of push through, to notice that that's normal. It's kind of like walking into a warm house after your hands are freezing. It's really painful when your hands start to warm up, but it's the process of healing. And with compassion, it's the same thing. You can notice that challenge maybe when you're more mindful or compassionate, and notice that like this isn't always comfortable. You don't always get that nice release. Sometimes it's challenging, and that it's okay. You can label it. You can ground yourself maybe in your breath or the soles of your feet or whatever, but to keep going, because that's part of the process. You've got to feel it to heal it and notice it.
I love that.
To be able to move forward, right?
Thank you so much for mentioning the concept of backdraft and putting that whole experience into words and explaining that it's normal to feel that, because what I've noticed for myself and my clients is that there are two, I guess, resistance points. And the first one is just getting started to begin with, right? The first step is always the hardest. But then the other resistance point is exactly the backdraft that you're describing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes my clients will also experience the backdraft, and things from the past will come up. Like all of a sudden, the practice of self-compassion creates this space where they can begin to feel things that they maybe haven't felt in a long time, that sports and movement and achievement and railing on your body can help suppress and attenuate those feelings, and they will come up when people are injured or stressed. And so when I get in a space like that with my clients, I always talk to them about, okay, this is what I'm noticing. You're mentioning things from the past, trauma. I'll just generally label it trauma. So keep going with the practice of self-compassion, and also let's look at you seeing a therapist and the modalities that I recommend for athletes are EMDR and internal family systems.
Yeah.
And so the combination of both a practice of self-compassion and therapy in a lot of instances can be very, very powerful.
Agreed.
I've thought this for a long time, and you answered this a bit earlier. What do you think is behind athletes pushing themselves so hard, even when they're injured, not waiting for the injury to heal until they get back to sports? And I'll tell you what I think it is, and I'm so interested to compare what is actually behind it with what you have to say.
Yeah.
I think it's fear.
Mm-hmm.
So fear, like you mentioned, fear of failing, fear of feeling, fear of having to deal with trauma from the past. So like fear that has kind of multiple arms. And then the fear sort of becomes a monster. Like, I just don't want to even go there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it could definitely be fear because there's a lot of pressures. There's the outward pressures, maybe from
Mhm.
parents or coaches or whoever, then also from ourselves. So oftentimes it's fear of looking weak, that you have this kind of athlete identity, you're strong, you're independent, whatever, and you don't want to lose that. It could be the fear of failure. It could be the fear of upsetting other people. Um, and it could also be just striving for success. It reminds me of the perfectionism literature, which in simple terms, it's going to divide the perfectionism into two parts. You can either be perfectionistic in terms of striving for success. You might think of athletes like Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan or something, where it's just like they weren't going to stop. They were going to be the best, and no matter what, they were going to be the best. There's also the perfectionism when you're avoiding failure. You want to be the best because you don't want to fail. You're just avoiding those negative things, and that might be a little bit more fear driven. So it can come from, I think, a lot of different places, and probably a combination of several, right? At times, maybe we are just seeking success. We enjoy it. We want to keep going, and other times it's we don't want to be seen as weak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think that's really good insight. And from what I've seen with my clients, there's another component to this, which I mentioned just a few minutes ago, which is trauma from the past. So some kind of attachment issue growing up, abuse, neglect, something like that. And so athletics and sport was a safe place to be away from the family or the trauma. And then it was a way to achieve and have another identity outside of the house. And so to take that away is just, it becomes an existential crisis, right?
Yeah, especially if it becomes such a big part of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So many athletes, when they're leaving sport, it's such a struggle. It's so hard if your identity, your athlete identity is such a big part of who you are. If you don't have many other kind of identities, maybe with family or friends or school, what have you, that strong athlete identity, when it's taken from you, it is a crisis, right? You're having an identity crisis. And so sports can serve a lot of different, it can serve us in many, many different ways in terms of building identity, friendships, learning hard work, perseverance. There's lots of things it can serve. It can also be a way to avoid struggle, right? We can get so sucked into sport just to avoid kind of challenges in other areas of life. And for each athlete, it's going to be different, and probably a mixture of several different things at different times. Yeah.
Right. It's kind of like a buffet, and at any given time, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of that and a little bit of this. So, right now, because of the pandemic, there are a lot of athletes who they don't have structure, they don't have their teams, some of them don't have a place to train, they don't have community, and so there's a collective grief going on, and it's a whole lot like an injury. And can you talk us through, I think you have a very genius way of translating self-compassion into language that an athlete can understand. So can you talk about how you would apply the practice of self-compassion in the current situation because of the pandemic? And then would that be any different in your eyes from applying it to someone who's injured?
Yeah, well, I'll start with, I don't think it would be any different necessarily. Kind of the beauty of self-compassion is it's tailored to the individual, right?
Okay.
Because we are kind of deciding what we need. It can change depending on the situation, period of life, individual. But I would say I do think that there's language that's going to resonate with athletes, injured or not. And so the first thing, if we remember kind of those key components, the mindfulness and awareness is the first step. We have to notice that we're suffering. We have to know that we're struggling before we can do anything with it. And so mindfulness and self-compassion turn towards suffering, not away from it. So I mentioned that phrase, you got to feel it to heal it.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that I would do is, whether it's setting reminders to check in with your body, with your mind, emotions, or if you want to have some kind of set mindfulness practice, we first have to make sure we're aware of what's going on, what we're struggling with. The next thing we need to do that I would say is going to be kind of a simple takeaway, is take some time to decide who your ideal friend, coach, mentor, future self is going to be. Take some time to really think about what characteristics are the most helpful for you in those tough situations, when you're feeling filled with shame, when you're feeling those really deep, strong, tough emotions, whether you're injured or whether you're struggling with the pandemic or the world current events right now. Think about what person, real or imagined, could be the most helpful to you in that moment. What attributes do they have? What are some things they might say? And really take the time, like you mentioned, kind of visualization. Imagine what they might look like if they have a figure or just some attributes. That's what I would say. It's probably going to be the most helpful. And then, as I mentioned, there's so with this program that I'm developing, I've kind of broken it up into four steps rather than the 3: mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. When you're in a moment of pain, struggle, suffering, the first is that awareness. You need to know, what am I feeling? What's the situation? What's going on? and to just label it. So maybe I'm struggling with lack of productivity right now. What are some things that I'm saying to myself? What emotions am I feeling? And just label it. The second thing is going to be this wisdom or common humanity, recognizing everybody struggles sometimes. Your situation is unique, and right, especially in the world, there's this collective suffering. You're not alone. Your experience is just as important as others, right? Keeping perspective and recognizing that we can learn and grow from this struggle. The next thing would be support and encouragement. So asking yourself, what do I need right now? What do I need to feel supported, to feel encouraged? Maybe it's just take a deep breath. It's okay, you got this. And then the last one is productive feedback. And I think this is the key for athletes. This is the part of self-compassion that's kind of the constructive criticism, the motivation. What do I need to change, to do better? Whether it's improve my performance, or maybe it's respond better to struggles in the future. And that's when you really want to tap in that encouragement and productive feedback, tapping into that person, your kind of ideal, motivating, wise person. And what would they say to me? What would they do to help me move forward? And I think, those are 4 really simple steps. You can ask yourself the question. You can do that as a written practice. You can come up with your own phrases, key phrases, what's going to help you. Or you can go through a meditation and just visualize that experience. And so I think for me that is kind of the bread and butter of a consistent yet simple self-compassion practice.
I love that. And I love how you break it down into 4 steps. I think that's something that an athlete can relate to. It's not woo-woo. It makes abundant sense. And I appreciate all of the work that you've done to come to that, because I know that it took years of research and discernment to distill everything down to 4 steps that an athlete would be able to relate to. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Luckily, I had a lot to work with Kristen Neff's work and all the self-compassion stuff, right? She's got a whole program, and there's been a lot that's really been about changing the language so that it resonates. Athletes resonate with that.
Yeah, which is very important, because if the language doesn't resonate, then the practice won't be adopted.
Exactly. It's the first barrier, like you mentioned.
Yeah, right.
It's got to be overcome.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a little bit about this just a minute ago. When I started practicing self-compassion, I found that having a notebook and writing things down was the most helpful thing to train my brain to begin to walk down that path and start the bushwhacking. And then after a while, I just very slowly gravitated to writing a little bit less and doing it more as a meditation. And I would say the meditation took me somewhere between 7 and 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And do you recommend that people start writing and then move to a meditation, or just do what works best?
Yeah, I think it's quite dependent on the individual. For
Okay.
people who already have some mindfulness practice or maybe do yoga, they might be more inclined to the meditations and want to do that. For me, I did not. I fell asleep, and I still fall asleep most often when I meditate.
Mhm.
So it can be challenging for me to focus. If I do, I need to open my eyes and like distract myself for a second, or go between meditation and writing if
Mhm.
I'm gonna do that. So I think it really does depend on the individual, and one's not better than the other. I will say that so Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, they have a self-compassion workbook that has several different exercises. Again, the language isn't adapted. It's kind of for the general population, but that can give some good ideas of writing exercises and meditations. And I would say go with what you're most inclined to do. And
Okay.
once you feel comfortable with that, challenge yourself to do something different. Because I will say, I was very against meditation at the beginning, very against it, because it was hard for me and I didn't like it and I didn't see the benefit. But through learning about it, I was sort of coerced into engaging in some meditation, and I see the benefit. So same with the finding some kind of touch. I thought that was way too woo-woo. I thought it was way too weird. But in Kristen's class, when I took it that first year as a graduate student, we had to go through and, as a class, practice different kind of gestures. And I was like, oh, it's actually kind of nice. So I would say be open to try some different things, and go with what works the best for you in that moment.
Okay. Will you walk us through some of the touch exercises? Because I remember when she walked us through some, I thought, this is weird.
Yeah.
This is really weird. And then, like I said before, afterward, I thought, wow, this feels a lot better.
Right. Yeah. So there's several. I'll show you the ones that I like the most, or some that
Okay.
I've kind of come up with. But the classic one is putting both hands on your heart. And so this would be, you're noticing really that kind of security, the warmth of your hands. You could also, if you want to feel stronger, you can have a fist, and then with your hand over your fist. I kind of like this idea of having kind of the fist signaling the strength, the motivation, encouragement, and then the hand as kind of the compassion. So it could be just,
I like that.
just kind of holding your hand and resting that in your lap. It's more about the intention and the meaning you're putting behind the gesture, right? It could honestly just be folding your arms. And noticing, though, when you're folding your arms, maybe noticing your hand on your arm, or, you could have one hand around your waist, and this is such a normal gesture to just stand with your arms folded. But if you've placed the meaning on it, then it's okay. It's going to signal to your body, okay, I'm choosing to respond with some compassion, encouragement. It's okay, right? This common humanity. I had one athlete who I was working with, and for her, actually, it was holding her hands in a fist. But she kind of put the tension, the criticism into her fist, and that was actually calming for her because she was giving it a direct space for it to go. Yeah. So it could be any of those things, right? Kristen also adds some. It could be putting your hands over your face, or just holding your hand, or putting it on your hands on your stomach, right? But we think with athletes in sport, we use touch all the time. High fives, patting each other on the back, a team huddle. And why do we do that? It's because there is this physiological response. It has meaning. And so deciding what you want the meaning to be. And like I said, I would encourage athletes to try a couple of different gestures. Try just putting your hands on your heart when you're when you're feeling anxiety, or you're feeling shame, or you're feeling whatever, and see how it feels in your body, and just take a breath and notice. It's worth trying.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it is. And it'll be weird the first time.
Yeah.
And I encourage everyone to make a mental note of how you feel before you do this. Check in with your heart rate, anything else in your body, like tension in your head, your jaw, your
Right.
heart, stomach stuff, and then do it and see how you feel afterward.
Yep.
So a real world example would be you're injured, you're frustrated, you miss your friends, you miss your teammates, you're feeling really impatient, you don't know when you're going to feel better. So taking those things, Ashley, will you walk us through how you would use touch to process those things? Like, what are the things you would say to yourself, for instance, if you have your hands on your heart and you have all of those feelings inside of you?
Sure, yeah. So with kind of that 4-step method, you can use the touch at the beginning and all throughout. So maybe it's first, I think it's important to start with a deep breath. The deep breath to like the pause, right? You're giving yourself the mental pause and maybe adopting that gesture and being like, this is hard. This sucks. I'm injured. I don't know when I'm going to see my friends. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm nervous. I'm anxious. And saying it kind of in that balanced tone. I'm not judging myself. I'm not angry. It's just, this is really hard. And noticing how am I feeling? I'm feeling tension in my chest, right? And then that next step, there's lots of athletes who have been injured before and who have felt this struggle, but they're kind of with me. They can connect with me. And so holding your hands on your heart that whole time, again, is signaling to your body, like, it's okay. This sucks. Validating your experience. This is so challenging and it's okay. You know, what are there some things that I can learn from this? Maybe not right now because I'm really frustrated and angry, but I'll get stronger, right? There's a purpose for this. And then what do I need to feel encouraged? Maybe you just need a hug. Maybe it's like, I just need to reach out to someone who's been injured before and relate with them for a little bit. Or maybe it's, I need some time to be alone and let myself be sad and angry and frustrated. Or maybe it's like, I gotta put this away, shelf it for a minute because I have a little bit of work to do, and I'll come back to this kind of emotion later. And then what do I need to, this productive feedback, what do I need to do? Maybe I need to take care of myself a little bit better, or maybe I need to reach out to my other friends who I know they're injured and they're about to get it worse. So I'm going to teach them and encourage them through my experience that I promise you it's not worth it. Don't overtrain. Set boundaries with your coach if they're trying to push you, or maybe, you know, like that, whatever that athlete needs in that moment. And I think going through that 4-step process, starting with a deep breath, putting your hands there, the whole time it's reminding you, it's telling your body you're safe, it's okay, providing some comfort, and while not rejecting the experience, right? It's hard. And what are you going to do? We can't reject it. We can't deny what's happened. It's happened.
Can't sell it on eBay.
Yeah. The first step is acceptance, and that's so hard.
It's so hard.
But we don't have to be stuck in it, right? Mm-hmm. Accepting it doesn't mean I'm complacent, I'm self-indulgent, I'm not moving forward. It means this is the first step of it happened, now what? Things look a little bit differently right now. What am I going to do about it?
Exactly. Thank you so much for that framework and taking us through it with a real world example. And it works with anything. It doesn't matter what the specific struggle is, whether it's related to an injury or something, any life challenge. That framework works for everything. And yes. That's why I think it's so brilliant. So thank you for sharing it with us.
You're welcome. And you can see it doesn't take long. It could take 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. It could take 30 seconds, 10 seconds. Once you get that kind of 4-step process down, it could be really, really quick.
Yep. Quick and powerful. Yes. And you mentioned some of the physiological benefits of this practice. Mm-hmm. Has that been studied, and can you speak about it? And even if it hasn't been studied, can you speak about it from an anecdotal perspective?
Yeah, I know there's some. I don't want to miscite anything or say things that aren't true. I will say on Kristen's website, she has all the research on selfcompassion.org, all the research outlined by topic or by authors. But with self-compassion, I would say the most well-established, clear finding with intervention. So as you increase self-compassion, your well-being also increases. So less depression, anxiety, stress, more life satisfaction. So that is just like found through several kind of interventions and studies.
Mm-hmm.
Self-compassion is also associated with more motivation, less fear of failure, right? More like the perfectionistic striving for success, perseverance, positive attitude, you name it, body satisfaction. So there's a lot of benefit to engaging in some type of self-compassion practice. Finding ways to improve your self-compassion can really benefit your life, right?
And I think there's a misconception about, if you alluded to this earlier, if I have self-compassion, that means that I'm just going to accept my fate and accept where I am.
Right.
But really what I've seen that it does is it opens the doors to moving forward in an adaptive, healthy way.
Right. Yeah. And when self-compassion was first established, we had those kind of three components, and it was really thought of as kind of tender, comforting, reassuring. But there's also another side of it, which Kristen's currently writing a book about. It's called Fierce Self-Compassion.
Mm.
Self-compassion is active, it's motivating, it's constructive criticism. When you think about an act of compassion, a mother taking care of a sick child is compassionate. A firefighter running into a burning building to save somebody is also compassionate. They're very different, right? The experiences
Mm-hmm.
look very different. So setting boundaries, motivating yourself, sometimes, right, the productive feedback, that's all compassion. It's all compassion. And that can be really helpful, especially for athletes, recognizing it's active. It's not just a passive, I'm going to eat a bunch of cookies today every time I don't feel good, right? It's keeping things in perspective, thinking about your success now and in the future, keeping your values in mind. And so it can be both a comforting, I'm going to take care of myself and kind of like go for a little walk or take a breath and take a break from something. And it can also be, I'm going to work way harder and I'm going to help my teammates alongside with me. And I'm going to come up with a game plan of how I can productively adapt, like an adaptive way, cope with these struggles. So it's both active and comforting and reassuring.
Yeah, it's so powerful. And I know I keep coming back to that, and it's worth repeating how important it is to invest time, especially while you're injured, and in investing in learning about self-compassion and then establishing a practice. And as Ashley said, it doesn't take that long, and the benefits are huge.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a lot of the benefits that we all experience. If you could be a little bit more specific and talk about benefits that athletes experience when they practice self-compassion.
Sure, yeah. So within the athlete literature, some of the, I would say, common findings are things like uh, when you're less likely to give up, take more initiative, take more responsibility. There was an intervention study by Amber Moswich where they found with women athletes, there was less kind of concern over mistakes, rumination, and self-criticism. There's also the well-being measures in sport as well. And then another big one would be the kind of the motivation piece, the like, more kind of mastery goals, positive mindset in the face of failure or struggle. So there's a lot, and the research with sport is kind of newer. It's only been in the last maybe 10 years or so, whereas the self-compassion has been last almost 20. But there's another perceived performance, associations with perceived performance. So there's a lot. Just think of all the good things, more likely to have that, and all the bad things, less of that.
I like that rule. Yeah, and you mentioned motivation, and that is a huge thing injured athletes struggle with, because it's for example, I'll take a runner. a lot, but you could apply this to any sport. The mentality is, if I can't run, I don't want to do anything.
Right.
And so it's either train for running or sit on the couch and perseverate all day. And there's so much in between, right? But people have to find motivation in order to do that. And self-compassion is a vehicle to finding motivation, as well as everything else that you've mentioned.
Yeah. And that's a perfect example of the difference, what self-criticism will do in that moment, right? Self-criticism would be saying, or the inner critic would be saying, if you're not going to go out and run for 10 miles, then it's pointless, right? You had on your agenda to run 10 miles. So if you're not going to do it, then you might as well do nothing. And we sit and we ruminate and we think, oh my gosh, I'm not good. I should be going out there, but I don't feel like it. I don't feel good. And we just go and we spiral, and we're just in this freeze response, or we're actively beating ourselves up, or we're just avoiding it altogether, right? The fight response.
Right.
Action might say, okay, you know what? Today's a little bit harder of a day. Maybe you don't go for a 10-mile run. Maybe you don't even go run. But let's think about, what can you do today to feel productive? Take what you have. Today's going to look a little bit different. It's okay. It happens. And you want to do something that's at least not just giving up, right? And so maybe you go for a really long walk, or you run for 1 mile. You say, okay, you know what? 10 minutes. I can do 10 minutes, and I'm gonna consider that good enough, right? So, is it reaching your 10-mile goal for the day? No. But if you're just going with self-criticism, you're going to do nothing. So having self-compassion is a great example of how it can be adaptive. It can help you progress and move forward, rather than sit in this survival, right? This survival process of fight, and freeze.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe on the daily schedule, there's not a run at all. Maybe there's not a walk. Maybe instead it's, as you mentioned earlier, it's reaching out to someone else who you know is struggling in a different way than you are with being injured, and you lend them an ear and you send them some love. Because if there's one thing that I've noticed in all of this, is that we can teach each other self-compassion.
Yes.
And so we can feed somebody else self-compassion until they can begin to feed themselves.
Right. Yeah. And we can model that for them, whether it's being compassionate and encouraging, yet motivating, right? And kind of giving them this productive feedback. We can act in that way towards the ones we care about. And there's lots of research showing, like, so within athletes, the more self-compassionate your teammates are, the more self-compassionate you're likely to be. So it spreads. Compassion spreads. It's contagious. And so if you can't go for a run, there's still productive things you can do, and you're going to feel better about it. It's not fun when you have a whole day that I just had one like a few days ago. I had a bad day and I just sat in it the whole day and I did nothing productive. And then the next day, once I was out of it, I had a good night's rest. I was like, oh man, there's so many other things I could have done, right? I had my one thing that I really needed to do that was the most, it's kind of in my face, the most timely, and I was so overwhelmed by it. And then I was mad at myself for not doing it, and I did nothing that whole day. Mm-hmm. And later I was like, you know, I could have said, okay, just spend some time on a different project, or maybe go work out, or maybe call somebody instead of just, sitting in my frustration. So I'm not perfect either, and I know that it's helpful, it's beneficial. We need reminders. We need people in our lives who can help kind of keep us accountable. And
absolutely. I went through a spell last year that was multiple days of just freezing and beating myself up, and I finally thought, I can't get myself out of this, and I need some help. So I called my best friend and explained to her what had been going on, and she said, how's that working for you? And I said, very poorly. And she said, okay. And she said, I think you need a little bit of change. How about incorporating more self-compassion in your coming days and see if that gets you out of it. And I released my expectations. I just said, don't worry about showing up for anything. And then I started doing a little bit more self-compassion work, and all of the pieces came back together. So basically by letting it fall apart and letting go of my expectations, which felt very out of control, and then incorporating self-compassion, things came back into control.
Nice. It's good to have a friend who you can have that kind of a conversation with, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to work for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome when we can have people who can guide us and be on the journey with us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
If people want to learn more, where are some resources?
Yeah, so probably the number one resource would be Kristen Neff's website, selfcompassion.org. She's got resources for self-compassion for teens, for parents. There's lots of research there. She's got self-compassion practices, meditations written. There's also the self-compassion workbook with Kristen and Chris Germer that you can get. If you want the athlete stuff and you want to have a conversation with me, shoot me an email. I'm happy to discuss that. But those are probably the biggest ones would be Kristen's website. She's also got a self-compassion book that she wrote about her life, about the construct. It's really, really good, a good, easy read. You learn a lot about her and how this all kind of came to be. And then the workbook would be a great, probably the best place to go to have some kind of consistent practice. Yeah.
Okay. Workbooks are very helpful when we're getting started.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. They're a little bit more guided, right? And they can help keep you accountable. Get a buddy, buy the book together, and work on a page a day or something.
Oh, I like that idea. That's a really good idea. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ashley. And I'm looking forward to you finishing your journey in school and being out in the world practicing all of this, because I think you have so much to contribute to everyone, and especially athletes. It's much needed.
Yeah, I agree.
So
yeah, I'm really excited. Hopefully in the next couple of years I'll have kind of the own adaptations, self-compassion for athletes and in sports. So I'm looking forward to that in the next
I am too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Heidi. It was
You're welcome.
Talking with you today.
Bye.
Bye.
I hope you all are as grateful as I am for Ashley, for her sharing her research, her knowledge, and how we can all practice self-compassion. As I mentioned early in the video, in between a stimulus and a response, there's a pause, there's a space. And in that space is our power. And I believe that every injury is an opportunity or a pause for us to regain our power as human beings. So we can metaphorically look at our life tree and say, maybe that branch isn't working so well and it's blocking out another branch, and maybe I need to prune that branch and I need to let this other branch grow more. And I would encourage you, while you're taking the time to prune your life tree while you're injured, consider pruning a branch that is blocking your branch of self-compassion, because that branch is a branch that will feed your tree for the rest of your life. If you're struggling, if you feel like you need help, you need more structure, you need a plan, you need accountability, please send me an email, heidi@injuredathletestoolbox.com. And on the next screen, I'm going to list the resources that Ashley gave us. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next time.